Great, so we'll get started here. I'm Mark Toulay. I'm your moderator for today, so if you don't like anything in the panel, it's all my fault. It's not these distinguished panelists. So I work for CECP, which stands for Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose. And let me see if my colleague Daniel is in the crowd. Daniel, are you here? If you could stand up, put your hand up. I guess he's not here, so this will be Daniel's last day at CECP. So show of hands. Raise your hand if you're representing a corporation. Okay, most of you. Raise your hand if you're representing an investor. Okay, and raise your hand if you're an NGO or unclassified. Trying to be PC here. Okay, that's great. Okay, so we started with the Gandhi quote. I'm going to get right to it now. So we're going to have a fun session. We want you to use your Slido. So you go to Slido. Is it com or co? Com, right? Slido.com? Okay. And you type in RBSNY. RBSNY. And we'll have a monitor in front of us, and we'll see the questions. And as they pop up, I'll ask them. So Slido RBSNY. So I'll start with a Gandhi quote because Liam started with that, and you can never go wrong starting with a Gandhi quote. So in 1930, Gandhi was asked, "What do you think of Western civilization?" And he said, "I think that would be a good thing." What would Gandhi say now when we're facing the consequences of inaction on climate change, environmental, and I would say presidential degradation? And I have a quote that I'm gonna say my one bad joke for today. So we had the CEO Paul Pullman of Unilever come and give a presentation to CCP, and he said Ben & Jerry's is introducing a new flavor of ice cream, peach and mint. They're going to call it impeachment. So. Anyways, I didn't say that, strike that from the record. At the same time that there are these challenges out there, it's amazing opportunity. And I'm going to jump right back right now into my role as moderator. And I'm really excited about the panel here. It's a very stellar panel where we have Mindy Luber, CEO and president of Ceres. She is if you remember the E.F. Hutton quote, when Mindy talks, people listen. It's really an honor to have her here, and we're delighted. Next to Mindy is Matt Digalipsky. How bad was that? On a 1 to 10? I got a 5. So next to that is Jeff Ramsayer. He's filling in, and he's with Gadara. We'll learn more about Gadara. And Mike Garland, assistant controller at Corporate Governance and Responsible Investing for the Office of New York City Controller. And last but not least, Matthew Welch, president of the SASB Foundation. So that was my hardest part. So now I'm going to go back to my seat, and we'll get involved in the questions. So I'll start with a question for everyone at the table. How can we reach the level of transparency needed to solve these challenges that we've heard today? And what does your organization do to help solve these challenges of transparency from investors?
Great. Are we starting at my end? Great, thanks, Mark. There are probably a number of things we could do. I'm going to start with what's perhaps a little harder to attain versus what we're moving towards attaining, I think, sooner rather than later. I mean, in the end, if something is important, and it's material and it's financial and it makes a difference, it needs to be disclosed, and I would argue not differently than any other financial information. What that says to me is it needs to be mandatory disclosure. We're going to talk a lot about voluntary disclosure, and Ceres built the Global Reporting Initiative, 8,000 plus companies using that system of disclosure. It's great, but in the end, we need clear and mandatory direction. One thing we did, because Mark asked what we're doing, in 2011 we were able to prevail upon the SEC to mandate the disclosure of climate risk and water risk. In this administration, it's neither being enforced or used at all. So we've got to go back to that, and that certainly is a goal, mandatory. So level playing field, everybody has the same set of rules and everybody's doing the same thing. But short of that, there's an enormous amount of good work going on. We need disclosure that companies disclose and investors use. It needs to be a bit more consistent than it is now. It needs to be metrics driven, so it's not just about we're good corporate citizens, but here are our goals and this is what we're doing to meet those goals. And it needs to be integrated. If a company is talking about their sustainability goals, it cannot just be their sustainability staff. It's got to be part of the core of what a company is about and driving the enterprise. So it needs buy-in, and I would argue good disclosure has the support and the sign-off of the CEO. It needs board buy-in, so they're overseeing those goals. It needs the chief financial officer and strategic officers buying in. We've got to make sure that disclosure is part of the reality of corporate practice. So it should be mandatory at some point. Right now, we should make it more consistent, integrated into what companies are doing and what's driving them. And for the investors, they want to see that companies are integrating it, talking about it, and looking at real material risks, not just this is nice, soft, pretty pictures on some externalities.
So, Matt, what do you say about the inconsistency of data? Is that a big barrier or not?
Well, no, it's a massive barrier, right? If you want to think about an investor such as State Street with a largely indexed position where we're a market holder, the necessity is for clear, comparable, consistent data, and high quality data at that. And I would agree that, we need information on environmental, social, and governance issues to be as accessible as standard financial data. And at the governance side, corporate governance data is far more, available than some of the environmental and social data. Not perfect on that, third element either. And absent compulsory, disclosure, we do need to see some sort of incentive from the market in order to provide this information. And that can come from a number of different ways. The first is to make it clear that we as investors are using this information as part of our investment process in order to create the incentive to provide it. If companies know that ESG information is driving capital, they're far more likely to provide the information to have capital flow their way. And that comes from a transparency as investors in how we're using that information, how we're using it to drive our investment process overall. The other is, and I think you hit on this, the importance that this isn't just about disclosure for the purpose of risk mitigation, it's also about disclosure for the purpose of understanding and creating opportunities for businesses to succeed in the evolving future. All too often when we talk to companies, and they're going through the disclosure process and going through, especially for the first time, all they're capturing is their impact side and how they're managing their impact, how they're monitoring their impact, what those numbers are. And very few companies, when you challenge them, have thought about the opportunity side. How can they adapt their business to succeed and thrive in the world that they're trying to minimize their impact based on sort of where they know where things are going. And finally, I think that sort of incorporation into the strategy is the key aspect of this. The ESG work that's being done by organizations, the sustainability work that's being done by organizations needs to be incorporated into the CFO's strategic planning process. All too often as an investor, I'll sit down on the phone and someone will bring to us their chief sustainability officer who will do a great 15, 20-minute presentation on everything that the company is doing and all of these great projects that are underway, how they're generating returns, how these are not lost leaders, but true opportunities for the organization. And then I'll ask sort of how does the CFO get involved in the planning process in terms of capital allocation and the like, and crickets. It's like, oh, well, there's a once or twice a year report that goes on to the planning group. And then better yet, you'll ask, so how did you determine the materiality, what was your materiality assessment in order to figure out where you were going to focus your efforts? And, oh, we're going to do a materiality assessment before our next report. And you sort of sit back and you say, How have you then thought about the work that you're doing, how it's going to drive the business opportunities, and how is it going to really impact the areas where it can have a financial impact on your business?
So that's not a best practice in integration? No, probably not.
It's an expectation, but it's an expectation that I think when you go into it, you expect most companies have done a materiality assessment if they've produced a CSR report. That actually can't be an expectation, surprisingly.
So Jeff, you represent all of technology here in the whole world, so no pressure.
All right.
So maybe what Mindy said is irrelevant because, in terms of big data, because or inconsistency of the data. I can't speak today, which is bad for a moderator. But is big data and artificial intelligence going to solve the inconsistency of data, or no?
Good question, right? The way we think about it at Goodera, I mean, our mission in the ecosystem is really to try to create the platform to pull together, you know, all the challenges that were mentioned previously. So I would say we're more in the big data. When we think about tackling the issues, it's less the AI, more the big data, in that, right, investors and other stakeholders do want to see information more frequently, more consistently. Not just quality of data, but comparability across many different, as SASB is trying to, you know, bring that consistency and breadth to the market. How do we help that process of capturing information and then ultimately being able to make better decisions and do you know, more detailed analysis on information? So I think big data, from our perspective, the C-suite of companies is, for the most part, bought into that, but the next challenge is, okay, how do we actually create the discipline and the systems to pull that data from across the globe in many different pockets? And that's really where Goodera tries to, you know, again, from our perspective, fill that void and bring some consistency and structure to that data.
So you can't do it in Excel?
Can't do it in Excel. You can do quite a bit in Excel. We actually met with Microsoft not too long ago, and yeah, they pointed out you should be using Excel for that.
They're not a sponsor, so
that's
I can
right.
say that.
So that, right, there's all different sources of content and a real opportunity to pull it together so it's more, you know, you can make decisions on it on a quarterly basis, monthly basis, and executives can have informed conversations rather than just reporting after the fact.
Thank you. And so, Mike, we're in the middle of proxy season right now, big flurry of activity. Thank you for being here. What are some of the hot button issues, and how do you decide where the controller office is going to spend their time in terms of directing its efforts?
Sure. The New York City pension funds have a very long history of engaging our portfolio companies on sustainable business practices. Historically, quite a bit around human and worker rights. I think for quite a while, just given the existential nature of the crisis, our boards have been very focused on climate change. One of the things that we did recently that we're proud of is we joined with a coalition of, we're part of several coalitions, including some coordinated by Ceres, and the Climate Action 100 that's engaging the 100 plus largest carbon emitters around the globe to reduce their emissions consistent with the Paris Climate Agreement. So a few weeks ago, we stepped out as in the lead of another coalition. So in the United States, the utility sector is responsible for 28% of greenhouse gas emissions. And we own, you know, probably every public company in this room. We have over 10,000 public companies around the globe. And so we made a demand upon roughly the 20 largest US publicly traded utilities are responsible for half of that 28%. We called on those boards to commit to achieve net zero emissions by 2050 and to disclose to shareholders some benchmarks and their pathway, how they expect to achieve that target. We've also been very active in partnership with other investors when it comes back to disclosure, asking boards to establish quantitative greenhouse gas reduction goals, either science-based targets or goals that are consistent with the Paris targets.
Thank you. And show of hands, how many people in the audience are familiar with SASB? Raise your hand so we know. Okay. So you've got high brand awareness. We can jump into it right away. So you've got, 10 trillion, zillion dollars behind you from investors. Why haven't more companies adopted the SASB standards?
Sure.
How's that for a softball?
Well, we love all of the companies that have taken the step forward as early adopters to begin reporting SASB metrics. It's well over 40 now, which is great. But keep in mind that we did not have codified final standards until last November. So it's really this year that will be the first reporting season in which we really expect SASB metrics to be used. Because our standards are designed for the rigors of reporting material information to investors, historically we said, like Mindy has spoken about, that it should be in mainstream and regulatory filings. But we have recognized from companies that many are going to start on a path and do so in sustainability reports. And so embracing that, we've said that's great, but it should be done with the same rigor as you would find in those mandatory filings. That allowed several early adopters to move forward last year and report on the provisional standards. We know even more will take steps now that we have codified and they're comfortable investing in the internal controls and the data collection process needed for it.
So don't forget to use Slido if you haven't used Slido, because I'm looking, I don't think anyone's done that yet. But so how do investors, this is for the group, how do investors organize to determine what kind of engagements to have on the proxy side or on the disclosure side? Mindy, maybe give us a sense of what efforts are going to kind of organize investors kind of behind the scenes.
Right. Well, like everything else, there are multiple, and I would argue multiple impressive and important ways that investors come together. Mike's been a leader at Council of Institutional Investors, and they do organizing. Ceres runs a shareholder campaign monthly meeting where 190 investors, Mike's been a leader, come together really just to look at what are the companies, what are their track records, what are the issues they want to be involved with, and there are many others around different issues, and I'm not suggesting one's better than the other. What I am suggesting is when they come together, the impact is extraordinary. So let me give 2 or 3 quick examples, and the importance of all of us owning the fact that as investors, whether with small, medium, or large investors, it's democracy. We get to vote our shares one way or another. Clearly, the shares of Scott Stringer in the comptroller's office in New York are bigger than Mindy Luber's household. I'd like to compete on that, but that will not happen. But think about 2 or 3 different examples. 10 years ago, the average vote on sustainability, climate, and disclosure shareholder resolutions was about 11. Now the average vote is about 38, and over the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen several over 50%. The average number of shareholder resolutions was about 25. Now it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. When shareholders come together, Mike just referenced the Climate Action 100 Plus. Again, it's but one effort, but it's 340 investors whose assets total $30 trillion who are saying we are together looking at the 100 most impactful companies on climate change, what they're doing, and we're going to engage with them until they change their practices. And this is not about campaigns where people show up in monkey suits trying to embarrass a company. It's about the very owners of the companies who want the companies to do well. So when you look at the kind of changes, 340 investors working together with $30 trillion in assets to move the 100 largest emitters of climate, the impact is already being felt, but it will grow every day. And it's a testament to the work of coming together, whether it's on diversity, on women's rights, on women at a corporate board level. There are many issues that are extraordinarily compelling, but investors have a great say in that. Mike has had, I'm sorry to keep picking on you, Mike, but a history over the last 2 or 3 or 4 years of moving corporate board members who really have the fiduciary duty to manage the big risks of companies, moving them in fundamental ways. That is only happening because of the force of investors coming together.
So what is the board's responsibility on these issues?
Well, I mean, if you take climate explicitly, you know, we've said climate risk is a risk to the business like any other fundamental risk, and it's the board's responsibility to oversee it and treat it as such, to provide shareholders with the information they need to understand and validate that the board is managing and mitigating the risk, and, you know, provide disclosure that's appropriate given the risk that exists. You know, and there's been a lot of focus around, you know, the oil and gas companies and mining and utility, because they are some of the highest impact companies. But we've also, you know, when we came out with that position, we said it is a risk that affects every company and every industry, just it affects them differently, and it's the board's responsibility to know what's going on. And so we're trying to make sure we expand our communication as well to look, you know, more recently at the forestry and agricultural industries, where I think globally they account for about 25% of GHG emissions, and sometimes are frequently, you know, overlooked because they do a great job of reporting on their impact on the environment and steps that they're taking to mitigate that, but not as great a job at reporting on what they're doing to adapt their businesses to things like increased flooding, greater weather events, and the like that are going to come from climate change. And, you know, as an investor, I want to know, not only are you trying to manage your impact, but are you actually thinking long term about how you're going to adapt their business? So that's going to be a growing area of focus for us.
And Mike, maybe
Yeah,
jump in
I-
here. And let me ask one other question
Yes.
tagged onto that. Isn't it the CEO's responsibility, not the board's?
No, that's sort of the direction I was going. Look, the average CEO tenure, 5 to 6 years. As a truly long-term investor, we have to rely on the board. Let's talk about climate change. Let's say you're an energy company, a utility, and you, if you're going to get to net zero by 2050, you have to start making capital allocation and strategic decisions today. And no CEO is going to make a decision whose payoff, even if it ultimately saves the company, is 30 years down the road. They're not going to be rewarded for it, and they're not going to be around to be held accountable if they failed to make that decision and the company and its share owners ultimately suffered the consequences. So it's really up to the board, I think, to make sure that management is focused on the long term.
Matthew, turning to you now, now that I asked you such an unfair question out of the gate, I want to come back and say, why is so many investors supporting SASB's efforts, and how has that really moved the needle so far?
Sure. I think what we see and experience at SASB is an evolution in the sustainability reporting landscape. There are a number of reporting frameworks out there, the veritable alphabet soup, which I know causes consternation to corporate reporters, but each of the frameworks evolved over time for different purposes, and they're valid. We're engaged together now in a project called the Better Alignment Project that brings together SASB and GRI and CDP and IIRC and several of the other major frameworks to better map the alignment between the reporting frameworks and to understand then the similarities and differences. The idea would be for corporations that you can measure once but perhaps report many times to multiple frameworks if you use them. The reason I think investors care about this is investors are not the same. Some have a broader social lens that they add into their full calculus of what are the financial returns. Others are purely interested in reducing risk and maximizing returns. And we need to serve all of them. SASB's part in this ecosystem is to focus on identifying what is financially material at a company level, what will show up in its financial statements, and therefore it's a good foundational layer for all of those investors. I think that's why we've seen the interest that we've had, but let me be clear, SASB is not doing it all alone. We were just having a little chat about how SASB is really a floor or a foundation for this. You really need to stretch up to the ceiling to consider full impact and externalities if we're going to solve all of the social problems that are out there.
I want to ask one more show of hands. I promise I won't ask again. But how many of you in the audience feel like you receive too many surveys on ESG ratings, rankings, and indices, and there's too much complexity out there in terms of this, which standard to fill out? That's a lot of hands. So that's a lot of barriers. So I turn it to Jeff.
Let me make one clarifying point, because this comes up a lot, and I want to be clear that the reporting frameworks are one side of the equation. The surveys and the questionnaires are coming from the raters, the rankings, and the data providers. And that's a whole different side of the equation, not represented among the folks of GRI and SASB. Altogether, it's a lot on the plate of companies. I don't disagree. But there's two different sides of the equation to work. One sort of commercial, and then the other generally nonprofit available infrastructure for company reporting.
That's a good point. We had a segment there. I want to turn to Jeff now. So Jeff, how does your platform help solve this kind of conundrum of complexity? And do we need more disclosure, or we just need better disclosure?
Right.
Maybe that's for everybody.
Yeah, I think just to add on to what Matt was talking about, there's also the convergence of ESG, responsible reporting on the ESG side, as well as the kind of the older sustainability annual report. And those, I think, need to come together in terms of what data are we tracking and who needs to see it. So it's really, when you think about a platform, that's the hope, that you capture information once and it gets to everybody in the time frame it needs to, with a level of detail. It needs to go below the company level, down to the business unit or the region or the brand even. And we have clients who have multiple brands who the brand wants its own face on ESG, right? Not just at the corporate level, but at the brand level. So supporting that is difficult, right? Because it's hard enough just to pull it up for the parent organization. So yes, it's. I think there's, again, opportunity there to pull the sustainability ESG frameworks together and make it so it may not matter how many different organizations are pulling information, because you have it organized in a way that's easy to respond. And over time, maybe even electronically responded more than it is today, rather than take it from here and put it into the survey.
Too much manual effort.
Right.
So others on the panel, so we saw many hands. It's clearly a problem that so many different people are asking for so many different types of information, and it feels, is it just a question of companies should be resourcing this differently? Or how do we get past this hurdle?
I do not think it's a matter of resources. I think it's a matter of choose a platform, use decision-making useful information, material information. SASB provides a good base that feeds into GRI, that feeds into other things. I appreciate that you're trying to limit the confusion, and I think the sooner the better that this grouping could come out and do that. But don't worry as much about which name goes onto it. Think about the material financial information that runs to your company, and your company is unique, and another company down the road is unique. You're not all going to be the same. Put it out there with clarity, in a fact-driven way, in a way that people can make decisions based on it. So the more pictures, the more mushy we strive to, we'd like to. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for real information and real goals. And in the end, I agree with what my fellow panelists say. Look, in the end, information about the financial stability of a company is mandatory, right? Investors must have that information to make decisions. Well, information about the metrics about this is, in the end, as I said, should be mandatory. And it should be integrated with financial information. We lose the importance when you got a sustainability report here and a financial report there. If sustainability issues are real or financial or material, if they run to the bottom line, then they should be treated like any other financial information. Currency risk, trade risk, inflation risk, those things aren't put in a cute little report over here that only one little department in a company has. They are thought about, they're integrated into the guts of a firm, into the planning, into the strategy, into the CFO's office, into what the board asks questions about. Sustainability issues, and not every one, but certainly the ones that have material financial risks need to be integrated throughout. And it's not a matter of resources, it's a matter of seize on one platform that you want to use and use it well and integrate it in your enterprise.
And Mike and Matt, as a consumer of this information, then I'll turn the slide out. Are you getting the information you need? You could just say yes or no.
It's complicated.
Maybe.
No, the level of information, Mike, you'll probably agree, is not where it needs to be yet. If you're talking about clear, comparable, verifiable data that we can use sort of at a fundamental level for decision making, but we're starting to have enough data to be able to get a view when you sort of look across what's available to us from various different providers.
No, I agree. I think I was looking for more and better disclosure. Also, I think Matthew and Mindy sort of alluded to this. A lot of the surveys are from, I don't care, we don't use rate, we use data providers. We like the data, so we're not looking at ESG ratings per se. It does seem to me that if you pick whether it's SASB and GRI, and you do the work to do a fulsome report using those internationally recognized standards, the rating agencies ought to be able to conform their surveys to information that you're already collecting and disclosing.
Yeah.
So the tail shouldn't wag the dog.
Yeah, I think if we're starting, as Matthew sort of said, we've all been discussing with financial materiality, right? If your disclosure stems from that, then the information that most survey providers should want to be part of their data collection process should be already out there. Because every data provider is going to provide their own twist or view that's going to be impacted by their conscious or their approach to these issues. But if you start from financial materiality, that's where our expectation would be the data providers are going back to, right?
So we'll start with the question here, and this would be for Mindy and State Street. What is the role of the CFO here? We keep talking about, we've talked about the CEO, we talked about the board, but what about the CFO? Is that critically important, or should we look elsewhere?
Look, it is critically important, and we just need to follow the logic of what we're saying. We are saying sustainability issues, whether it's climate or water or diversity, and there are different issues that touch different enterprises or companies. They are financial issues. And so a chief financial officer, funny about that, is supposed to deal with financial issues. And they run to the strength of a firm. If you are an agricultural firm and you've already had 2 rounds of water flooding that caused you to reduce your crop by 1/3, so literally losing 1/3 of your profits 1 year, or you're an apparel company, as we saw 2 years ago, when either drought or floods did in cotton crops for Gap, for hundreds of apparel, those are financial issues. You need to look at the risk, you need to do scenario planning, you need to factor it into your profits. The CFO's office just needs to be involved in financial issues. And if we stop thinking about these as good guy ESG issues in a separate little cute report, but true financial issues, it's not a very big reach to understand that financial players within an enterprise need to be evaluating and acting on that risk.
Yeah, and there are a bunch of different ways that we can get to that. I mentioned sort of at the opening that sometimes I'll turn and ask, how does the CFO's office get involved? Other times when we're engaging directly with board members, asking them about how they challenge their investor relations team, which generally falls under the CFO's office, to use this work as a differentiator when they're out on the road pitching the business, right? And that sort of, is always welcomed with a little bit of skepticism, sort of, oh, really? People aren't asking, we still hear this. The mainstream investors are not asking about this information, about the, sort of this element. But our point is, why are you not telling them? If you're sitting here and you're telling me that your decision making around these financially material issues is going to create an opportunity for the business, why are you not selling that as a differentiator? And so that's another way that you can sort of engage the CFO's office, is understand the value creation, the value proposition, rather than just sort of how you're sort of reporting out on these issues.
Yep. Matt, anything to add on that, or the whole?
Yeah, I was thinking of a couple points as we were talking about this here. SASB engages quite a lot with CFOs because we think that standardized ESG reporting needs to have the same rigor as traditional financial reporting. And in our standards development process, which spanned the last 7 years, we spent a lot of time meeting with companies and getting feedback on the standards. And when we did, we would always ask for a meeting with the CFO, the sustainability person, and the investor relations person. And sometimes as SASB went in to meet those folks, it was the first time they were meeting each other. That's kind of a scary thought. That tells you we're at early stages of this, at least in some companies. The other element that I think about important for the CFOs, is that this is how a company tells its story and its financial value creation story. And many CFOs are not fully aware of the data that is out there with third-party data providers and what drives ratings and rankings and to some degree investment decisions of asset managers and owners who make decisions based on data that their company is not controlling. If they're not actively telling their ESG story in a good report, those third-party providers make estimates and they come up with their own analysis. That is very sobering for a lot of CFOs we talk to.
So another question from here. For all the companies that had their hands up earlier, aren't investors really the problem here in that, do I hear applause? No. In that the time horizon is too short for investment decision making. So we're on kind of a quarterly earnings, what Larry Fink calls quarterly earnings hysteria. And meanwhile, the company's trying to drive long-term value creation. How do you deal with the time horizon issue? Mike or Mindy or Matt?
I think that it's certainly true that companies, I think management feels the pressure to operate on a quarterly cycle. I think it is the responsibility of the board and long-term investors, whether it's the structure of pay, to try to get them to focus on the long term. I never, people always point out, companies often say, no one on our quarterly earnings call ever asked about climate change. I mean, if you think about it, the people who are on those phone calls are looking to make trading decisions in the near term. They're not the people who are thinking about the long term, even if they believe in perfect markets, that if you're planning for 50 years out, it's priced into your share price today. I don't know that anyone believes that. So I just think it's unrealistic to assume that the people on your quarterly earnings call are representative of your long-term shareholders. And I think the onus is on the company to engage with its owners.
I agree with that.
Mark, one specific thing, and just in addition to what Mark said, people do what they're paid for, right? So if everything is based on quarterly earnings, they're going to build towards that. I mean, we're now asking companies and working with companies to tie compensation of the top 10% or the CEO only to certain of the largest material risk sustainability issues. Set a climate goal and hold the team accountable. People will do that if that's what they're told and that's what their goals are. Shell agreed with investors prevailing upon them in Climate Action 100 Plus to set audacious goals, perhaps not enough. They are still an oil and gas company, but they are tying their top 1,200 executives to those goals and to implementing their climate program. We've got to tie the compensation systems and the incentives to the goals we're talking about. Mm-hmm. It doesn't answer the full question, but it is one way. Boards overseeing those goals is yet another way.
So I almost hesitate to answer this question here, but it has 5 votes. So this is a democracy, so we have to, and I can't have a left-right bias here. So the difference between terminology always comes up. So how do you advise the companies, investors at the table, differentiate between ESG and CSR? And what would you tell companies the difference between the two, or how to discern the two?
I think it's those terms can also be used interchangeably. So maybe I'll step back and say it's important for companies to think about who their stakeholders are and consumers of the information that you're disclosing. And in your sort of ESG, CSR, responsible investing, wherever that report is that you're putting out, you are serving multiple stakeholders. I think SASB does a really good job of, did a really great job of sort of from the onset, and Matthew should probably talk about this rather than me, sort of identifying that their stakeholders were going to be the investment community in terms of the consumers of their information. Let me know if I got that wrong.
You got it.
And so that is one element that we're looking for. If you want to make sure that your reporting serves those stakeholders, then look to something like SASB as that starting point. GRI, right, has a much broader set of stakeholders in terms of who you're trying to reach with the reporting. And so I think it's more about companies understanding who their stakeholders are with their reporting and with the different elements of their reporting, and making sure that the report can be easily digestible by those different stakeholders when they come to get it. Not an easy task. I don't necessarily have the solution. But rather than getting sort of lost in the alphabet soup, really think about the different stakeholders and how you're serving them.
Yeah,
Others?
if I can add to that, yeah, I think sometimes we see ESG being thought of as more of the quantitative side of analysis, and CSR being the qualitative, the storytelling. And again, I think bringing those two together, I think Jay mentioned this morning in his panel, talking about stakeholders, like you're really, and this is to the CFO question as well, when you're sharing this information, you're sharing it with your employees, with your customers, your suppliers. It's not just the investors, so it has to all come together from that perspective. And I think that those two terms are, they are interchangeable, but I view it as kind of quantitative, qualitative, and pull those together.
One way I think about it is a little bit of value and values. I mean, I think CSR is, I think to be successful and create value for shareholders, companies do need to be responsive to and accountable to their communities and stakeholders. But there are, when I looked at ourselves, there are investors out there, whether they're faith-based investors or socially responsible investors, who define themselves, they're mission-based investors, and their mission is to change a particular practice potentially for the good of society. We're a mission-based investor. Our mission is to provide retirement security to the working people of the city of New York. And so at the end of the day, it does have to be about value. I think a lot of the issues that were advanced through CSR have, I think companies and investors now believe those are material to value creation and have found their way into things like the SASB standards.
Anything to add to that, Matthew?
At the risk of being controversial, and I'll disclaim this as not an official
Ooh, I
SASB
like it.
position, just my personal take, I worry that the term CSR, which was very useful at the outset, now is a reason for some people to disregard some of this information, to set it aside and say that's for social purpose, not for financial purpose. That's why, at least for SASB's work, which we do focus on financial materiality, we describe it as sustainability information or material sustainability information, or ESG, which I think is neutral and not values laden in the way that social responsibility is, which is not to say that it's wrong. Companies have many stakeholders, and depending which company you're in, a social responsibility narrative may be tremendously important. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying I think there's value in thinking about when does a company frame its work for its social or social responsibility considerations, and when is it speaking about environmental, social, and governance factors that are just tied to business value creation.
If I could be one step more controversial, where I believe we need to be going, not as whether ESG or CSR, people are going to define those things differently for time immemorial, that we don't have any of those categories. If these things are real financial risks, they're real financial risks, and the more we border them or frame them in some little box over here, they're a special little cute category. That is not where we need to be going. If something matters to the firm, it ought to be part of their responsibility, and no three-letter term should describe it. or define it. It should be part of what the responsibility of a board, a CEO, a CFO, and the corporation does. And the same thing if you go to CSR. Companies do have to have a bigger value than their narrow return on investments. And I don't mean they should become social networks, but they have a role in society. And the more we put that in a little box, CSR or ESG, the more it gets compartmentalized. So I hope I'm sitting here talking to all of you in 5 years where we're using neither of those terms.
Great, so drop CSR. That's my advice. How's that for income? Now, diversity's come up earlier in the morning, and it's got the most votes here by far. So why are boards and CEOs still male, pale, and stale?
He said it, not me.
I mean, isn't this a challenge we should have tackled like 10 years ago? Why are we still talking about this?
Because directors don't like to tell other directors when it's time to go.
Okay. Mindy, why don't we have more people like you on boards and CEOs? What's wrong with the system? It's clearly not working.
The system is not working. It is changing, but very slowly and not nearly at a rate that we need. We're seeing more women. We're not seeing enough diversity. And the very notion, there's a reason why diversity at a board level or at any level is important. Our decision makers should reflect the world around them. And the world around them is not male, pale, and stale 75-year-old white men. And we still see a lot of that. The incumbency, CEOs put on their friends. That is starting to change, but the system is not moving fast enough.
I'll say too, this morning the Fearless Girl made an appearance. Some of you might be familiar with the statue by Kristen Visbal just across the river there. When we launched the Fearless Girl campaign to try to accelerate some of this change and address the value that can be created by diversity, a large number of the companies that I spoke to would say, you are the only investor that's coming and raising this issue with us. So if you want to know why you haven't seen sort of the pace of change up until this point, it's largely because for whatever reason, it wasn't part of the discussion. What I'm most proud of the work that we've done around this campaign isn't the 400 plus companies that have added their first woman to the board since we launched it. It's that our peer institutions, and Mike, I think you were actually in front of us on this in terms of a topic by years, but generally the investment community since that time has found that this is an area where we can speak collectively and companies will listen. And so instead of me picking up the phone and saying, wow, it's the first time I'm hearing about this, it's like, geez, this is the fourth conversation I've had in about 4 days about why my board doesn't have any diversity. And I appreciate that, and we're trying to fix it. And fixing it does take time. Adding board members is not a fast process. But what we are seeing and starting to see is the acceleration. And so I think, to your point, the hope is that we've managed to unlock the power of the market to some degree, and we'll continue to see that snowball. But I think it's very easy, given sort of, especially the collective consciousness of the folks in this room, understanding the value of diversity, of cognitive diversity, and the need to bring that to successful teams. The reality is that sort of at that board level, we're just starting to get going, and I'm hopeful for the future.
And Mike, how about you? Do you vote against every company, every issue, every proposal, everything a company says if they don't have any diversity? I mean, I'm overstating.
We vote against, starting this year, we vote against the nominating committee of any board that does not have at least 20% racial and gender diversity. It's triggered more by gender only because we don't have the information. There's very good data on the relationship between gender diversity and value. There's not as much research, frankly, on racial diversity because we don't know unless you can go and look at pictures, or investors don't and researchers don't have the information to do the research. It's pretty easy to guess gender.
How is SASB going to solve this? It must be in the criteria, right?
I'm not sure SASB solves it per se, but we do identify diversity as an important factor in our standards. Keep in mind that SASB standards don't cover traditional corporate governance metrics. We think those are tremendously important, but they were already well developed, and so we didn't reinvent the wheel and throw them in. We do find diversity manifesting itself in a number of industries as a top-level, likely financial material issue. The challenge, too, becomes how do you consider this when you move out of a U.S. context? How do you measure diversity of a global conglomerate? What should be the diverse makeup in Germany versus India versus Latin America versus the U.S.? I think there's some real thorny problems to work through. I think diversity as a concept is agreed upon that it improves decision making, but how you measure it, what's the right level, how do you instrument it is still an emerging practice.
Okay. So this, let me go around the panel, ask this. We've got a big challenges ahead. One of the questions here, I'll kind of tie the final question here into, we might have time. Do we have time for taking questions from the audience, or? Okay, so we got a mic. Anyone that's not using Slido that wants to get in on the conversation? Hands up. Or everyone that is using Slido? In the back over there.
When you say your target for gender diversity on the board is 20%, why not aim for 50%?
Thank you.
Well, I think it's because we believe that the step we're taking is a fairly aggressive step to withhold, we're a significant shareholder, voting support from directors. I think that's a fair goal, but it's not embedded. It's certainly an aspiration, but should we be holding boards accountable for their failure to get there? Maybe, but that's not where we are.
So the final question go around. So I'll go back to what I was saying earlier. What is the call to action here? And if you're a company and you're deciding which framework to use in your reporting, one of the questions here was, and it just dropped out. So,
Second one.
yeah. Would you suggest that companies suggest the best of all the standards and report whatever they think is financially material? Or would you suggest that they, how do you suggest that they kind of navigate through this complexity? I know we talked on that a little bit.
Well, it's your territory.
I'd love to start with that one if you don't mind.
Yes, I think you're entitled.
All right, thanks. I think we see this now. A number of companies, I'm thinking of NRG as one, Nike, others, are writing their sustainability reports incorporating a number of different frameworks. And this makes sense because, as Mindy said, it's about the information that should be communicated to stakeholders, including investors, especially investors from my perspective. It's about getting the information there. The frameworks are just tools to help identify the information and disclose it in a way where it's decision useful for the reader. So SASB's goal isn't that there be a certain number of SASB reports. We want SASB information in the marketplace. And we see many people do that in a report that may say, this is what we've identified as important to our business. Here are a couple GRI metrics that describe performance on that. Here are SASB metrics, and so on. And I think that practice is emerging. We're also seeing that information start to move from sustainability reports and into financial filings. And that's great. It may not be a full SASB report in SEC filings, but we see our metrics covered, our topics well covered with metrics often in those filings. And I think that's for the good of the market.
So the call to action?
So the call to action is really identify what is important to your business, use the tools available to you to communicate that in a decision useful way, and tell your own story. Don't let the third-party data providers and raters and rankers tell it for you.
Tell your own
The
story.
frameworks are important just for, for investors' ability to compare the data. When I think about GRI and SASB, we support both. To me, SASB is a bit of a floor, and GRI is the latter. You can get much more comprehensive reporting. I do think, I think SASB's original aspiration was to ultimately make its way into the SEC filings. I do think that if we ever achieve that aspiration, it's more likely to change company behavior, because the board and senior management have to be looking at and managing those metrics. I do worry, we are strong supporters and advocates of GRI. I do worry about the siloing nature of a lot of people in this room do good work, and that gets reflected in a sustainability report that may be on the company's website. Whether that, how that ties into the company's strategy and how the board, what the board knows and is overseeing with respect to that activity, I think the risk of that being siloed is great. But I do think that SASB and GRI are compatible.
And what's the call to action? How do we get to that 50% target that was mentioned earlier? What can people in the room do to help? That was for you, Mike.
I think it has to do with, Mindy referenced early on, buy-in from the top, the board.
Tone from the top.
Yep.
Jeff,
Yeah,
how is your application going to solve all these problems?
Well, I would think about it from the theme of communication. If you have something good to say, then say it. Someone's going to be saying it. So if you don't, as an organization, your peers will at some point. So I think there are enough reasons, aside from just the investment need for information, to share what you're doing across all the ESG goals and metrics. So once you commit to that, the communication side of it, hopefully the industries and peers will follow. Maybe that's too idealistic. But I was in a workshop a few weeks ago, and we were talking about, this already happens on the SEC side with supplemental data, and with filings, there is information that becomes almost regulated, but it's not, in the sense that if it becomes a norm in an industry, and the industry comes together and says, these are material things we should be reporting, and here are 3 companies that are doing it already and doing it well, shouldn't we all fall in line and save all of ourselves some heartache, and probably expose some things that make them better companies in the end anyway. So again, maybe that's too idealistic, but communicate, especially if you have something great to say. And if you don't, then figure out what,
Follow the fearless girl, right?
Another way to say it. Yeah.
So
Pat, your call to action here?
call to action. So I think I would say identify the sustainability issues that are financially material to your business, preferably using a framework such as SASB's. Incorporate those issues into your strategic planning and understanding of where the business is going on the future, and then communicate that to the market, to us as shareholders, taking into account the need to discuss what you're doing from a broader stakeholder perspective as well. Just make it simple.
Great, and my simple concept is reporting is reporting. It's information. Your job is to not only report the right information, but use it to drive behavioral change. Otherwise, it's a bunch of, even if it's well done, it's words, it's numbers on a piece of paper. No matter how pretty they look, it's words and numbers on a pretty piece of paper. Use this information to drive change, so that it's what gets measured gets managed. The simple concept. Allow it to, and help build it to integrate throughout your enterprise. So the CFO is working as part of it, the legal team's part of it, your supply chain team is part of it, your board sees what's in it and buys into the goals. Use this, as it should be, as a driver for change, since we want to change practice, not only change the words and the numbers on a piece of paper.
Well, the difference, anybody know the difference between try and triumph? A little oomph. And it's great that we have everyone on this panel that is giving it a little oomph and making the world a better place. And so join me in thanking this distinguished panel.